Hey everyone, welcome to this week's Azure Infrastructure Update. It is the 4th of April. As always, if this is useful, a like, subscribe, comment and share would be appreciated. And we actually have a very nice bag of new updates this week. Firstly, new videos. I posted kind of a deep dive all about the Azure Resource Graph. This is this phenomenal capability to really get information about all of your resources in Azure, even if there are over hundreds of subscriptions, kind of sub-second. And then I posted an April Fool's video about this pretend new feature that lets you reboot regions. I posted that on Thursday, and then Thursday there was an Azure outage. Unrelated to my command, but an unfortunate coincidence. So I don't think I'll be doing that again. Onto the new features. So compute, now the DSv3 and the ESv3 support disk bursting. So remember, this is the idea that both virtual machines and the disk have limits around throughput and IOPS. And what we can now have is at the VM side, because remember the disk side already has bursting for certain size disks, the VM now has this bucket that it can exceed its regular IOPS and throughput for up to 30 minutes in those kind of peak times. And if we look, for example, just at the DSv3, we can see it talks about, well, hey, look, I have kind of this regular amount of time where I can actually see, hey, what is my kind of normal interaction? And then we have this idea of, well, there's these burst values as well that I can actually get. So there's this max burst cached and this kind of max burst uncached. So this can exceed its kind of regular values that kind of goes up as the VM gets bigger. So we now have that extra bucket we can utilize, and it even kind of says at the bottom, hey, look, this has this bursting for up to 30 minutes at a time. So there's no extra cost for that. It's just, hey, if I have these short-term bursts of IOPS or throughput, now I'm going to kind of get those with the DSv3 and ESv3. Then AKS had a number of new features. So firstly, the run command. This is a pretty nice capability. Now I can think about just from the command line, so AKS, I can do a command invoke. And that does a number of different things for me. It helps me maybe just test connectivity to the cluster, but I can also then actually run, for example, kubectl commands directly from this. So now without having to actually go and do any kind of special connection, just through that AKS command invoke, I can do double quote kubectl git nodes or whatever I want to do directly from there. So that's now in preview. There's now this node image auto upgrade. I have talked about this before. It's really the idea that I think about, well, hey, there are these images that run on the worker nodes themselves. And obviously there's new versions, there's kind of minor version upgrades, and I can now configure this auto upgrade behavior for me. And I kind of select how aggressive I want to be. So if you actually go and look, you can kind of set this auto upgrade channel, and it kind of says, well, do I want to get kind of the patches as well? So this will only go to the patch version of your current version. So for example, hey, if I'm on basically something 1.17, even if there's newer minor versions like 1.18 or whatever, it will only upgrade to the same patch version, i.e. 1.17.9. Or I can say stable. Well, in stable, it means it will go to kind of whatever that latest version is -1. So in this case, hey, it will go to 1.18.6. Or I can kind of go rapid. Hey, look, just give me the latest version. So I can turn that on to get kind of that automatic upgrade functionality. 1.20 of Kubernetes is now GA. And then the Open Service Mesh OSM add-on is now in preview. Now there are various different types of add-on. The whole point of these service mesh functionalities is there's certain aspects of my Kubernetes environment that can be troublesome when I think about, for example, pod-to-pod communications, controlling the traffic. I can do that, but what these mesh technologies do is they add sidecars. Remember, the whole point of a sidecar is when we use Kubernetes, remember what we fundamentally have is we have these pods. So I have the idea of this pod. And in that pod, we kind of have our main container that is running our application. But a sidecar is kind of, well, another container that gets run inside the same pod that does things. So this open service mesh, it adds a sidecar into all of these pods, for example, Envoy, that enables kind of this better pod-to-pod communication. It gives me more control, a whole bunch of other things that I can do. So that open service mesh add-on for AKS is now in preview. On the networking side, service tags for user-defined routing is now in preview. Now remember, the whole point of a user-defined route is we think about, well, hey look, I have here my virtual network. So I have my VNet, and what we have is a whole set of default routes. There's a certain route that it goes out to the internet. Some things modify that. For example, if I had something like a gateway, all those gateways, for example, ExpressRoute or a VPN, adds routes to say, hey, the IP space that is connected to via that gateway, well, you're going to go via the gateway. But maybe sometimes I add my own kind of network virtual appliances. And I want certain traffic, for example, to flow via that network virtual appliance, no matter where kind of those resources are. And so traditionally, I would use a UDR. And a UDR basically says, hey, if you want to get to this target, you're going to go via this. This is your next hop. Now imagine I wanted to say, hey, go via a network virtual appliance before I go to various Azure services. Maybe it's, for example, Azure Storage or whatever that might be. Well, there's a massive range of IP addresses for the different Azure services. Now, Microsoft does publish a document. You can go to this document, and it's a JSON file. They update it kind of weekly, and it's all of the IP ranges. And if you look at this file, it's a massive JSON document. So for storage in South Central US, I would have to add user-defined routes with all of these IP ranges in to make this work. Well, that's absolutely hideous. But there are service tags for these. If I was to just go and look, for example, at a network security group, so something super, super easy for a second. So if I just look at my network security groups, just so I can show these kind of super easily. If I look at one of these, you'll notice, hey, look, I can actually say my destination is a service tag, and you'll see all these different service tags. And you can see things like, hey, storage. There were service tags for global storage or storage for certain regions, and there's all of these different things available. So what this new change is basically letting me do is now I can actually say, as part of that user-defined route, instead of having to have all of those IP addresses for whatever that Azure service might be, I can just use the service tag. I could say storage or storage.southcentralus, or I could do things like Azure Cloud or Azure Cloud South Central US. So the whole point is now I can actually use those service tags as part of my UDR. So hey, if I want to get to this, then my next hop is this particular NVA. So that is now available to me. There is a certain kind of preference for these. So if it was a service specific, region specific, that would kind of count first, then kind of global service, then Azure kind of cloud region, and then Azure cloud, which is kind of everything. So that if I have multiple entries for those different levels of service tag, it's going to do service-specific, region-specific first, then service-specific, then anything in a region, then just Azure all up. So we can now use those, not in the portal yet, but I can do it from an ARM template, PowerShell, CLI. ExpressRoute monitoring is now part of Network Insights. So remember, Insights is this curated view that's opening up for more and more services. So now my ExpressRoute details will also show as part of my Network Insights. So it shows my peerings, my connections, my gateways as kind of a nice topology view. I can see the health and the provisioning status. I get metrics on the circuit, so availability, throughput, packet drops, and then I get the gateway metrics as well. So all of those things will now kind of show up through that ExpressRoute part of the Network Insights. On the storage side, so Azure Backup for Managed Disk is now GA. Now the important part here is Azure Backup is acting as the orchestrator. Remember, when we think about Azure Backup, there's really kind of two parts when I think about a backup solution. I can think about, well, there's the orchestration component of it, and kind of there's the storage as well. And so what this is all about is the orchestration. So I can think about, well, I have kind of a managed disk, and the way we really think about taking copies of that is it has kind of a snapshot capability. So it kind of stores those snapshots on regular hard disk drive storage, so it's as kind of cheap as possible, and it does incremental storage. So what this integration is doing is Azure Backup becomes kind of just that orchestration. So it's not taking the data and copying it to Recovery Vault. It is not doing that. It's simply orchestrating the creation of the snapshots and then cleaning them up when it goes past whatever my policy is that I define. So if we look at this, for example, if I just quickly go and look at, let's say, Backup Center. Nope, that's the wrong place. I don't want to do that. If we look at Backup Center in this bar, too many bars, we can see, hey, I have different types of things supported, but I'll change the data source type here from virtual machines over to disks. And then we can see, yes, I've actually completed a scheduled backup, and I can see I have a backup instance. And there we go, there's the disk I've protected, and I can see down the bottom it's going to show me the restore points. So these are actually the snapshots that have been taken. So here I can see down the bottom, I kind of have one snapshot. And I can also see my backup policy that's been applied here, where I can see it's basically, I'm going to keep it for 7 days. And you can see it does it every day at 1 o'clock. And there that is. And these are just regular snapshots. So if I actually go and look at snapshots, we can see, well, there's the snapshot for that disk. So the Azure Backup for Managed Disks is simply acting as an orchestrator to go and create the snapshot on the managed disk. Now, a key point here is it's acting at the managed disk level. Obviously, there's a virtual machine that is kind of attached to that disk. This could be the OS or data disk. There is no interaction with the VM. It's not calling VSSS, the volume shadow copy service for Windows to kind of quiesce, pause and flush things out. It's not calling freeze if it's Linux. This is just a crash consistent. There's no interaction with the VM at all. It's zero touch, it's crash consistent. It's just taking it at the disk. That might be exactly what you want. So it gives me that ability to now have that orchestrated, zero impact or performance impact on the VM through Backup Center. If I want app consistent, then I would use Azure Backup, and it will integrate with the OS itself. Then encryption scopes have gone GA. Now remember, encryption scopes are the idea about that, hey, when I have a storage account, and I did a whole video kind of deep diving into this, your storage account itself is encrypted. So it's encrypted at rest, and it can either be kind of a Microsoft managed key, or it can be a customer managed key, where that key goes and gets stored in Key Vault. And that applies to everything written. Well, then you have Blob, So with blob, I kind of have the idea of containers. And then inside container, I have one or more blobs. So an encryption scope lets me actually configure, so I can have encryption scope 1. Well, this uses a different Microsoft managed key. Encryption scope 2 uses a customer managed key, but a different one. And now what I can say is, well, hey, look, container 1, you're going to use this encryption scope. Container 2, you're going to use customer managed key 2. So in a single storage account, I can use different keys to do the encryption at a container or blob level. So maybe I have different customers in one storage account. I could now encrypt them differently. And it's super easy to actually use. If I just jump over to my storage account, firstly, we'll actually see over here we have encryption in the settings. Well, from there you can see I have encryption scopes at the top. So here I just created one, a new Microsoft managed key. But again, I can just give it a name, and is it Microsoft managed or customer managed, in which case I'll have to pick the key vault and pick the key. And then all I do is, when I create my new container, I can say under advanced, hey, I want to use a different encryption scope. I don't want to use the default encryption key configured for the storage account. I want to use a different one. And then, hey, use it for all of the blobs automatically in the container. Now, if I don't set one at the storage account that's the default, sorry, the container that's the default, if I actually go in and I say upload, I can actually pick within here a different encryption scope. So actually that was, let me do something different for a second. Let me go out of here. This was before I actually did all that. Let's go over here. So you can see kind of there'd be the option to actually pick a different encryption scope, but I set a default one here. But otherwise, I could pick a different encryption scope actually at the blob level. So encryption scopes basically give me that ability now to have different encryption keys used for different containers, or if I don't set it at the container level, even a different one at the blob level. So that's a pretty nice capability if I have that requirement. Maybe I have some service I run for different customers. PostgreSQL Flexible Server now has a CLI Connect option. So basically now what I can do is just from the AZ CLI, I can do like an AZ Postgres Flexible Server Connect. So again, that proves connectivity, but also I could run single line queries actually against my Postgres database. So a very simple way to interact, to test, and actually do simple things. Azure Monitor Insights and workbooks for CosmosDB is now in preview. So remember again, Insights is that fantastic curated view of things we most likely care about. Well, over here, if I jump again, I did some really basic things on my little Cosmos database earlier on. If I go to my Insights, so it's down here, Monitoring Insights, it's showing me like overview. Hey, look, we always care about these 429s because that means we try to do things beyond your provisioned request units, which those units of kind of work. And I can see, hey, I maxed out at 100% as well, but I can also look at things around throughput, requests, my storage, availability. And of course, there are various workbooks again. Here's that Azure Cosmos DB Resource Insights, which because it's a workbook, I can customize and do other things that I care about. So that is there available for me. And then Azure SQL Database Serverless option, which is where I can have kind of a min and a max vCore count. It can auto pause because I've got the separated compute and storage. That now supports a zone redundant option. So it can actually span different availability zones within the region, give me additional resilience. And miscellaneous, there's quite a few of these. So PSArm is in preview. Now, it wasn't that long ago I talked about Bicep, Bicep is a domain-specific language that basically removes the need for me to create ARM templates. It's a much friendlier thing. So what PSArm is, it's using PowerShell as basically a way to have a domain-specific language. So using PowerShell features like loops and conditions and all those other things, well, I can now create an ARM template. So basically it has a certain format that I wrap things in kind of this ARM block, and then I just specify the resource. Now as a special name, it has to be a PSArm.ps1 file. Now I run it through a command and it will spit out an ARM template. And there's examples, you can go and look at the documentation. And the key point here is why you might want to do this is if I love PowerShell, I love its logic, I love its loops, all those constructs, I can use all of those things to spit out the ARM file. Now I have things like loops and conditions native to ARM, native to Bicep, but they're that specific. Whereas this is just using regular PowerShell constructs to create that. So it's something to look at. I don't think it's going to kill off Bicep in any way, but it's just another option that you can look at as maybe if you are all in PowerShell, you can look at it as kind of a nice way to create an ARM template. Then there's AZ Next is in preview. So this is the AZ CLI, and PowerShell has kind of this read line AI-based command to automatically predict what you're going to do. And there's actually kind of that Azure extension for that. So what this is bringing is kind of a similar thing for the AZ CLI. Based on what I'm doing, it says, well, hey, maybe you want to do this. Now you might be used to AZ Find. So if I just kind of go and look at this thing, I can do AZ Find. And if I don't put anything, it's going to kind of error, but it's going to say, hey, did you want to help get a command around AZ storage or whatever that might want to be? But AZ Next looks at, well, what have you done and what might you want to do next? Now, right now, I've not done anything. So it may not really have a clue what to recommend. But if I quickly just create in a location, South Central US, and we'll just create a resource group, John Group 2. So now I've created a resource group, and that's done. Now, if I do AZ Next, can you help me what I might want to do next? Well, it's going to say, oh, maybe you want to create a storage account, or look, well, in this case, look at storage accounts. Maybe you want to create an app service plan. Maybe you want to create a deployment group, I deploy a template. Or I can just say, well, actually none of those things. But if you just type AZ Next in the latest version of CLI, it will go and pull down the extension to really enable this functionality. So you can go and take a look at that. So there you go. Azure Policy Change Events now integrates with Event Grid. So what does that mean? So obviously Azure Policy is great at the ARM level to say, hey, this is what I want things to be, and it can either audit if things aren't or actually enforce it. Now let's say I'm just auditing. Now ordinarily I can think about there are things that do stuff, and this could be something like an Azure function, for example. It could be some kind of webhook. There's a whole manner of things that do stuff. Then there's things that create signals. Maybe I write a blob or something happens. But now one of those things could be, hey, there's a change in my policy state. Maybe someone's done something now, it's out of compliance. I'm just doing kind of an audit policy, but now it falls out of that. And in the past, we'd have to kind of do something called like a hammer poll. Hey, has something changed? Has something changed? Has something changed? So what Event Grid does is Event Grid kind of sits in the middle of all these different things. And Event Grid has a whole set of different things that it supports as kind of signal sources, and then things that can handle events from Event Grid. So now that policy state change at a resource group level, I can configure, hey, Event Grid kind of watch this. And then I can configure, hey, if there is something happening in this resource group about policy state change, I want you to go and, hey, trigger this particular Azure function. And I can do kind of advanced filters on this to say, well, actually I only care about this particular subset of stuff happening there. So this is actually a really nice way that Azure Policy has certain kind of built-in remediation for certain things. But now I can essentially say, hey, if the policy state changes, call this. And then really the world is my oyster to what I can do through that Azure function or webhook or really anything else. Azure Data Explorer external tables is now GA'd. So this is kind of that idea that, hey, I might have data in Azure Blob Storage or Data Lake. And what I can basically do is take a sample of data from that, bring that into Data Explorer so it can work out, well, what is the schema for that data, and then reference it as external data. So I don't have to actually bring it into Data Explorer to run queries against it. Azure Backup now supports Azure Dedicated Host VM backups. So all that means is, hey, remember Azure Dedicated Host is I get the box to myself, and I can fill it up with VMs of whatever is supported on that box. Well, now Azure Backup supports backing up those VMs on that Azure Dedicated Host. Also, Azure Backup now supports the backup of VM scale sets, uniform and flexible. I really think this is more about flexible. So remember, the flexible orchestration mode was really recently introduced. It's the idea that ordinarily uniform VMSS means I have kind of that template and it just creates the VMs for me. They're generally stateless. I probably wouldn't care about backing them up. Flexible mode lets me create basically an empty virtual machine scale set. Then I can just add VMs into that I create. So maybe they do have some state I care about. So Azure Backup is supported to actually back up and restore to those VMs that are part of a VMSS flexible orchestration mode set. And then Azure Monitor for Windows Virtual Desktop is GA'd, a phenomenal kind of insight and very easy deployment into everything running in my Windows Virtual Desktop environment. And then the Azure Security Center had a whole bunch of updates. We can actually get that to load. There we go. So if we jump over here, so basically Azure Firewall is now integrated into Security Center. We can kind of see that. There's the ability to now disable rules for the SQL vulnerability assessment. So if you don't care about that, you just don't want it to show up, I can disable the rule. We've already talked about these workbooks in Security Center before in previous weeks, but it's kind of talking about those three: secure score over time, system updates, vulnerability assessment findings. The audit reports are actually now linked directly from Security Center. So this is actually pretty nice. So if I actually go to Security Center and look at my regulatory compliance, rather than going to kind of the Trust Center and getting those reports, I can just go to Audit Reports now. And there they are through all those same kind of headings that we have seen before. Additionally, I can now actually look at recommendation data and like more and more things. I've talked about this in previous weeks. I can actually just look at the resource graph query to actually see that. So if I went back and I looked at my recommendations, and let's say I just pick a certain recommendation here, you can see there's an open query box. So that open query will actually open the Azure resource graph with the query to get the data that it's actually showing me, and kind of there it is. So that's, I think, a nice enhancement there. And then there's some updates to policies for kind of the whole workflow automations that we have. Some other legacy recommendations: don't write into the Azure activity log like it used to, but instead it follows the standard flow through Azure Advisor. And then just some recommendations page enhancements. So if we actually go and look at the recommendations page, you can kind of see now, hey look, there's this max score, my current score, how I'm doing. And there are some new icons I'd see down the side for certain things like quick fix. They're now little special icons. And if I don't group by controls, that thing up here in the top, well, now I can actually see which initiative, in this case the Azure Security Baseline, is actually driving those recommendations. So a bunch of nice things there as well. So as you can see, kind of a lot of things this month, but that's it. I hope that was useful. As always, until next week, take care.